course, a man with a gun. It's absolute panic here in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters. Detectives have their guns.
In March of 2020, one of the most important magazines on world economy wrote, "Everything's under control." But who's in control? But who's in control? Who's in control? Who's in control?
Thank you, Alex. Yes, I listened to the president's press conference today, and my reaction is this, that he is correct. We are at war with an offensive biological warfare weapon.
Nos dá a possibilidade de que o coronavírus já estava rolando na Lombardia em novembro, ou seja, concomitante aos primeiros, provavelmente, que foram contaminados em Wuhan. também já foi provado em vários papers científicos. O strand, a vertente do vírus na Itália, é diferente da vertente chinesa, que é diferente da vertente no Irã. Variantes do coronavírus. E a variante chinesa é a C. Na China só tem C, não tem A e B, o que já prova, por definição, que não surgiu na China. Veio de outro lugar, provavelmente Fort Detrick, provavelmente, não temos certeza.
The 35th President of the United States of America was shamelessly assassinated on November 22, 1963. Although Lee Harvey Oswald had been accused of being the assassin, however, without sufficient evidence. The crime remains unsolved until today. Oswald was assassinated by Jack Rubin 2 days later, on November 24, 1963. March 2020. Robert Zimmerman, a poet's poet, from the USA, better known as Bob Dylan,
Dark day in Dallas, November 63.
Released a 17-minute long song titled Murder Must Foul. The following commentary was published on Billboard's website on April 12th. Murder Must Foul debuted at the top of the charts for digital rock sales April 11th, becoming the first #1 song in his legendary career as a Billboard artist.
A day that will live on in infamy.
In requiem form, and using metaphors, it describes the possible relationships between President Kennedy's assassination and subsequent episodes.
President Kennedy was a riding high. Good day to be living and a good day to die. Greatest magic trick ever under the sun. Perfectly executed, skillfully done. Wolfman, oh wolfman, oh wolfman, howl. Rub-a-dub-dub, it's a murder most foul. Hush, little children, you'll understand. The Beatles are coming, they're gonna hold your hand. I'm gonna hold your hand.
The decade of the 1960s was marked by historical episodes in politics, culture, social behavior, philosophy, libertarian social movements like Women's Lib, which was a feminist liberation movement, started appearing throughout the decade of the 1960s. Gay Power, which was a homosexual liberation movement. Black Power, which was a black liberation movement inspired by leaders like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And the Black Panthers, which was a powerful wing of the Black Power movement. The birth of English rock during the famous British invasion, which invaded America and the whole world with the Beatles, Rolling Stones, and other bands like the Yardbirds, The Who, Eric Clapton's The Cream, and so many others. Still, closer to the end of the decade of the 1960s through the middle of the decade of the 1970s, progressive music mixing jazz, rock, and psychedelic would arrive. The Canterbury scene in England and progressive rock, which came from regions spread across the country. The sounds of bands like Genesis, Yes, Gentle Giant, King Crimson, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and other bands which mixed rock with Baroque and classical 18th and 19th century music were exploding and changing the concept of making young music, indicating a new direction for musical language. In other European countries, bands like The Focus from Holland. Another strand of English rock arrived with Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple, which, with their hard rock, invented heavy metal rock and Ozzy Osbourne's Black Sabbath, all caused a transformation in the rock aesthetic. In the United States of America, the powerful free jazz of saxophonist Ornette Coleman appeared and contrasted with the other throwaway musical movements from the music and entertainment industry. Just like some strands of North American rock pop, without a commitment to the more serious social movements. But some bands were involved with these social libertarian movements like Grateful Dead, MC5, The Doors, and a few more bands. The decade of the 1960s was also the era of pop art, the peak of underground cinema. Luis Buñuel's European surrealist cinema, Federico Fellini's cinema realista, as well as strands of cinema from Hollywood. Scientific fiction for cinema and or TV like Twilight Zone, whose subject matters even involved quantum physics in a period where it was only spoken of in the academic world. But on the other hand, the popular throwaway Hollywood cinema had, at that time, and still has, the largest audiences. Finally, a quite contradictory society with industrial productions which shock with one another in their symbolic meanings. The May Revolution of 1968 entered into 20th century history as one of its biggest events. In France, important intellectual expressions like Michel Foucault, Gilles Deleuze, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Guy Debord, among others, went to the streets to demonstrate against capitalism, consumption, American imperialism, and traditional institutions. Certainly, a leftist social movement. The height of the Cold War in 1962 marked international tension between the USA and the USSR when the Kennedy government confronted the Russians through tense political negotiations about a military base installed in Cuba. The establishment, which sustained an economic ideology led by the United States, contained pathological aspects in relation to its economic creed. This psychological illness, according to the logic of liberalism, was maintained and became ever more egocentric. To the USA was granted, or persuasively taken, the patent, Guardians of the West. Because of that, upon assuming the label of police of the Western world, opposing the logic of first world power, they did not spare strategic attitudes to impose their sovereignty. In defense of capitalism, the USA has used its military force to impose and to mark territorial boundaries. In an apocalyptic tone, they fought against a supposed demon which never existed, which was their antithesis. The Russian communism, their principal opponent, the second world power of that period. An almost infantile dispute, boys who compete to see who can spit farther. With historical documentation accessible to any person, we can affirm that the United States government encouraged, through its intelligence service, coups which installed military dictatorships in various countries throughout South and Central America, with the justification being to protect capitalism and to guard against an eventual Russian invasion through Cuba. To tell the truth, they marked territories, giving the West the following message: the USA controls the West. With its armament and economic potential, its obvious and natural politics of invasion and dominion was characteristic of the great powers. In the case of the United States of America, among its greater interests were in petroleum-producing regions of the world. The industrial 20th century society, with all its contradictions, was producing a culture of paradoxes and extremes. The revolution of the 60s had two basic segments among the youth. The ones who believed in the revolution through love and peace. And those who belonged to a more intellectualized generation, the counterculture, believed in the revolution and in the liberating through intellectual emancipation. In some way, this notion was inspired by the Illuminist ideals of the 18th century and their derived philosophical schools, which influenced the 20th century. They were inspired by great contemporary and previous century authors, and the study of philosophy was obligatory. Freud, W. Reis, E. Fromm, Jung, Karl Marx, Nietzsche, Foucault, Sartre, and the critical theory authors of the German school in Frankfurt, Adorno, Horkheimer, and H. Marcuse. Other authors inspired rock bands which became famous, like The Doors, based on Adolf Huxley's Doors of Perception, and Steppenwolf, based on Hermann Hesse's The Wolf of the Steppes.
If you're going to San Francisco, be sure to wear some flowers in your hair. If you're
The youth wanted to change the world. The governments, the church, religion, and Christianity in general, which formed the system that oriented the paths of the world, didn't please another part of the youth.
If you're going to San Francisco, you're gonna meet some gentle people there.
As a matter of fact, this part of youth which wanted to change the world through peace and love were hippies who appeared around 1965 in San Francisco. But this was a subversive world, given the system that preached war and armament economy sustained by the petroleum war ideology. These first hippies were exactly there in California, on the West Coast, within the reach of their persecutors. This was an outrage to want peace and love in a country governed by war leaders. The great contradiction is that the controllers of this war economy were men of the government, normally with a Christian, Catholic, or Protestant upbringing. And the hippies stood for the principal Christian commands of love and therefore peace. The legitimate hippie generation, not the false imitation, was the most effective and inoffensive that existed, and obviously was subdued, becoming a boutique ideology. The government leaders convinced the youth to go to war, to fight for a cause that was not the youth's, but was the older generation's. The hippie generation was preceded by a violent generation, that of the Wild Boys, Marlon Brando and James Dean, rebels without a cause from the decade of the 1950s. This generation, which had returned from the Second World War without a perspective on building a new life, exactly the post-war generation. Neurotic and psychologically traumatized from the war, for this post-war generation nothing was left but violence as a form of protest, and this was exactly what happened. The hippie generation was the opposite of the post-war generation. It was the other side of the coin. The hippies showed the world that another form of survival was possible, without war, with love and peace. But this dream was short-lived. It didn't pass 1970, which coincided with the end of the Beatles and John Lennon's celebrated phrase, "The dream is over." Relics of this hippie ideology are still around today, but are inefficient. In all truth, just a part of the youth from the decades from the 1960s and 70s were libertarians. The other part adapted to the system, ready to give continuity to shrewd economic liberalism, cunningly going after power at all cost. This alienated part of youth is what has given continuity to who we are today, a chaotic society with a large part of our youth sympathetic towards extreme right movements. The freaks, who existed at the same time as the hippies, were an important social expression because hippies were politicized. The freaks were conscious of the hippie movement being fleeting because it was smashed by the mass media, by the establishment, and they were conscious that it might even change some social behavior, but it wouldn't knock over the supreme structure of the system. The Beat generation, with its poets and philosophers, which started long before the hippie era, was very important for the formation of new ideas that appeared, especially to the counterculture and for rock music. But this is a story that will have to wait for another time.